Hello and welcome to By the Book. This is your host, Joe Hebert. Today we continue our series on truth, justice, and leadership with the study of Plato's Gorgias. In previous episodes, we saw that Socrates approached Gorgias, who is a teacher of rhetoric, and his question is, what is the power of rhetoric? And Gorgias responds by saying the power of rhetoric is that you can persuade anyone of anything without having to study the subject matter. Socrates points out that this means, in essence, that you're deceiving people since you don't know what you're talking about. You persuade them anyway, but without actually knowing whether what you're telling them is true. Gorgias flip-flops a little bit in terms of how to respond. On the one hand, he doesn't want to admit to having any unjust motives. So he, first of all, he deflects the blame and says, it's not my fault if people misuse the art. But Socrates makes clear that, well, you have to have a plan for this. Are you going to use the art justly or not? So then he claims that, well, in fact, of course, my intentions are just and I'm using it justly. I'm going to teach people to use it justly. But Socrates points out then, why is it that you're even trying to persuade people without knowing if you have just intentions? So that's a dilemma that Gorgias runs into. And the solution is that his student, Polus, steps in and says, the solution is simple. Gorgias isn't telling you the truth. He doesn't want to admit. But the reality is that we're not paying him all this money just to learn how to be just. We're paying him all this money to learn how to be unjust and how to deceive people and how to profit from deceiving people. He was embarrassed to say that, but I'm not embarrassed, Polus says. So now Socrates turns to questioning Polus. And last time we looked at round one of that discussion. And the first point that Socrates makes, which is extremely significant, is that when you're deceiving other people with rhetoric, you're not just hurting them, which is obvious, but you're also hurting yourself. Why is that? Because you're doing, through this kind of power, the kind of power of getting what you want, you're getting what you think you want, right? You think you know what you want, and once you use something like rhetoric to obtain it. The problem is, he says, there's a difference between what you think you want and what you really want. And Polus says, well, what do you mean? How could there be a difference there? And he says, because what if you want something and it turns out to be bad for you? Is that what you really want? You really want a bad thing? No, of course, everybody wants good things. So Socrates says, when you judge correctly and you want something that's good, then that's fine. But if you misjudge and you want something that turns out to be bad, then what you wanted isn't what you really wanted, right? So in other words, we don't necessarily know what we want. And unless we're prepared to think very carefully about what is objectively good, then we can make mistakes and we can pursue things that are harmful for us. And Socrates basically indicates any kind of an art or technique that we use to obtain things without stopping to think about the truth of the matter, without training ourselves to actually analyze things objectively and truthfully, is dangerous at best. We may be harming ourselves as much as anybody else by not recognizing what we want. So Polus has to admit, in terms of the argument, that makes sense, that there is a difference between what's actually good and what we think is good. And getting what we think is good is not necessarily good for us. And therefore, it's certainly not such a cut and dried thing that rhetoric is going to help if you're using it in the way that he's planning on using it. So this time we're going to look at the second half of the Polus discussion as Polus continues to push back a little bit on Socrates, and Socrates gets into phase two of his critique of what Polus and Gorgias are up to. So last time we saw that part of Socrates' technique is that he calls people as a witness against themselves. That is, he shows that people are in contradiction with themselves. And that's how he's going to prove a point. Now, Polus, being a student of rhetoric, he tries to use these rhetorical techniques on Socrates. And basically what he's doing, he's doing something similar to Socrates' method in a sense. He's saying, Socrates, you don't really believe what you're saying. there's no way that you would not go for the kind of power that I'm talking about if you had that opportunity. Now, that's ironic because in this conversation that we're witnessing, Socrates is the one who wins all the victories in this conversation. These are people who professionally train to win arguments, and Socrates actually beats them in all these arguments. He controls the whole dialogue, basically. So that Plato is saying something very significant there, is that Socrates does actually have the same kind of power that Gorgias has, and he does not think that that power is an end in itself or that it's such a great thing per se because of the reasons that we're seeing. Because what really matters is knowing what's good, not just having the ability to get things whether they're good or not, right? But Paulus, also uses a technique of saying, look at all all these people here, look at all the people in the city, look at all the people on the planet. Everybody's going for power. That's what everybody's doing. Like, you must be crazy if you really wouldn't do that. Either you really would do that and you're just pretending, or if you really believe what you say you believe, you're a weirdo. Like, you're the only person on the planet. And so part of what Socrates does, he keeps pushing back and saying, this is not the way that we settle a debate. We don't settle a debate by just appealing to these random masses of people and what they supposedly believe. He says, I'm going to settle this debate by showing that you, Paulus, actually agree with me, even though you don't realize it. And we see here in this quote, let's take a look at it. This is an important piece where Socrates says, I imagine that you and I and the rest of humankind believe what Socrates is claiming, which is that it's worse to commit injustice than to suffer it. So what Socrates has come to here is the question of what's really good for us, going back to his initial discussion with Gorgias. Why should we want to be just? Because justice is intrinsically good. Justice is a kind of health of the soul. And just like we would never want to be unhealthy if we could help it, we would never want to be unjust if we could help it, because it's kind of an unhealthiness, a sickness of the soul. And so it's worse not to pay one's just due than to pay it. In other words, to get away with injustice is actually the worst thing. It's like getting away with being sick and not getting cured. I mean, if you're sick, you would want to be cured. If you're unjust, you would want to be corrected so you can become just again. And this is what Paulus just doesn't really believe. He doesn't believe anybody could really believe this. Nobody really behaves that way. People try to get away with injustice. They don't try to get punished for their injustices, right? So he just can't buy it. And he says, Paulus says, and I say neither I nor any other human being believes that. You choose then to suffer injustice rather than commit it. And Socrates, he doesn't just say, well, yes, I would. He says, so would you and everybody else. So this is, it shows the radicalness of Socrates' claim here. But I want to point out that the standard that Socrates is using is not his personal opinion. And for his part, too, Paulus is actually in the same boat. Paulus isn't saying, hey, in my opinion, it's great to have power and to do things. They're both actually claiming something really crucial, which is this is human nature. This is the way human beings are. So this is a debate about human nature. And just like with Machiavelli saying people are selfish by nature, that's all there is to human nature. Tocqueville, on the other hand, saying that, yes, there is a selfish side, but there's also an unselfish side, a disinterested side to human nature. So that's precisely what is at stake, and that's why Tocqueville is pointing us to Plato, because he's saying that Plato is the one who really digs into this question of human nature and really shows the greater complexity of human nature, and that's precisely what this dialogue is about. So how is Socrates going to prove that Paulus and everybody else actually has a concern for justice? Says to Paulus, which seems worse to you, committing injustice or suffering it? And Paulus, of course, says suffering. He thinks that's common sense. Nobody wants to be a victim. And people would rather commit injustice than be a victim of injustice. And Socrates says, but what about this? Which seems uglier, committing injustice or suffering it? Now, this is going to be a really crucial point. We've already seen that Paulus is a lover of beauty. he has his, he's injected this word beauty quite a few times into the dialogue. And we're going to see that this is very significant because this is where Paulus is going to come to realize that he doesn't really believe what he's saying. He doesn't really believe what he thinks he believes on these matters, because beauty and ugliness obviously are the opposite things. And from the Greek, you can translate this differently. So you might translate it in this context as shameful, which is more shameful. Shame obviously is kind of referring to how we appear to others or how others respond to us, whereas the beauty and ugliness is more of a direct reference to the attractiveness or unattractiveness that something has. But those are really tied together in these Greek terms. So we can easily see what the point is here, saying that, Paulus is saying, well, in reality, I would rather do injustice and get away with it, but I understand that there's something shameful or unattractive about like I have to hide it. When you commit injustices, you have to hide it because it doesn't look good, right? Even Machiavelli stresses that you have to pretend to be just. You don't want to seem unjust. So Paulus thinks he's on safe ground here and saying that, yeah, there's a distinction. And this distinction is actually very important for the sophisticated man of injustice who he recognizes that, injustice may be beneficial in many ways, but you don't admit to it. You don't advertise it. You don't brag about it because it doesn't look good, right? So Socrates is going to point out a major problem with that sophisticated perspective. You think you're really smart and you're making this smart distinction, but does it really make sense? So Socrates says, well, therefore injustice must also be worse if it's an uglier thing. And Paulus says, not in the least. So what Socrates is pointing out is by making this sophisticated distinction and saying, well, injustice is useful, but it's ugly. I admit it's ugly, but it's useful. Then it means, well, so you're saying that injustice is good, but ugly, and therefore you're saying that ugliness is good, right? And which means beauty is bad, or at least beauty doesn't matter. Beauty doesn't have any connection to goodness because ugly things can be good, right? So this is going to be the problem. If the true, the good, and the beautiful are united with each other, then trying to separate those things is impossible. You can't say that something is, it's a beautiful falsehood, for example, or it's a beautiful, harmful thing. It's harmful but beautiful. If the true, good, and beautiful go together, then, the ugly and the false, and the bad have to also go together. So Socrates says, oh, I understand. In other words, I understand the precise contradiction that you're living with at this point in your life. Very likely you believe beautiful and good aren't the same thing, and bad and ugly aren't either. And Paul says, certainly not. So Paulus is still confident that this distinction is going to hold up. Well, let's see what happens to it. So Socrates is going to respond by digging in a little bit to what we mean by beauty. We're just going to look at a little selection of a longer, dialogue here. Socrates says, but what about this? With all beautiful things such as bodies, colors, shapes, sounds, pursuits, is there nothing you're looking to when you call them beautiful in each case? In other words, is beauty just a word that we throw around for some random reason we call something beautiful? Or is there something behind it? Is there some reality behind what makes something beautiful? And if so, what would that be? For instance, he says, in the case of beautiful bodies, first, maybe kind of the most obvious type of beauty, just visual beauty, physical beauty. Don't you say that they're beautiful either as a result of the fitness each one has for some end it's fitted to, or as a result of some pleasure, if upon being beheld they cause the beholder to feel delight? Do you have anything to say about beautiful bodies that goes beyond these things? And Paul says, I don't. Now, in fact, we certainly could go deeper into exactly what makes something beautiful. And later in the dialogue with Callicles, in the Callicles discussion, we are going to go into a little more depth about what makes something good or beautiful or true from Socrates' point of view. But we're starting to get a glimpse. First of all, we're looking at something objective. that there's something about the order or the structure, the fittingness of the thing. The thing is in good condition, basically, for whatever it is. Obviously, a beautiful flower is going to be different from a beautiful human being or a beautiful animal or a beautiful sunset. But what would hold them all together, Socrates is suggesting, is that depending on what kind of thing this is, if it's in a good condition, then in itself, it's in a fit condition, and it's something that gives pleasure. It gives us pleasure to see that. So we're starting to dig in a little bit to the substance of really what makes justice and related virtues actually intrinsically good. What makes them like health. Just like the body has a structure, when all the organs and systems are in order and they're doing the right function, that's what makes us healthy. And likewise, our soul is capable of seeing the order of things in general, and it delights in that order, because when we see things are in the proper order, we see that is intrinsically good and beautiful and attractive and fulfilling for us to contemplate. Now, Paulus doesn't necessarily go that far in his thinking, but again, he is a lover of beauty. And when he hears, okay, something is beautiful because it's in good shape and because it gives pleasure, it's like, yeah, that's right. That's a big part of his life, is he likes to enjoy, take pleasure in the beauty of things. That's important to him. And what Socrates goes, next is that this isn't just physical objects, but we're talking about human beings and their actions and their state of character and all this kind of stuff. So the things that have to do with laws, what we should do or not, and pursuits, actions and ways of living, activities, beautiful ones, that is, presumably don't go beyond these bounds of being beneficial or pleasant or both. So he's just making it clear we can apply the same standard to all types of beautiful things, even on the human ethical side of it. What makes a person, beautiful, not just in their body, but in their character or their actions, is going to be related to there's something that is beneficial or pleasant in their actions and behaviors. And Paulus doesn't disagree, right? I mean, he's not necessarily quite as enthusiastic about this. So we can see perhaps he hasn't really thought about this before. He's not quite as sure about it, but he doesn't have an objection to this so far. And is the beauty of learnable things of the same sort? So Socrates now tying this in with the true, the good, and the beautiful. The fact that we learn something and we see it's true, isn't that also related to it's being beautiful? And Paul says, quite so. And now, at any rate, you're laying things out beautifully, Socrates, in defining the beautiful by pleasure and good. So once Socrates has connected the true, the good, and the beautiful in this way, Paulus, he has a little bit of hesitation, but when he finally sees them clicking together, he is enthusiastic about it. He says, now you're speaking beautifully, Socrates. So notice how he's not only just agreeing, but he's actually applying the theory. He's saying the words you're saying are beautiful because I can see the truth of them, and I can see that that's the way things are. That's the order of things as we experience it. So this is a very strong endorsement of Socrates's point of view here. But of course, it completely conflicts with what Paulus was saying about injustice being good, and Socrates is going to demonstrate that now. Socrates goes back to what Paulus had said. So if committing injustice is uglier than suffering it, then either it's more painful, and it would be uglier by exceeding in pain, or it's uglier by exceeding in badness, or in both. Isn't that too a necessity? So, if beauty is something that is useful or pleasant, then ugliness must be either harmful or unpleasant. And Paulus says, well, yeah, those are the only options that we have here. So Socrates says, first then, let's consider this. Does committing injustice exceed suffering it in pain? And do people who commit injustice suffer more pain than those who suffer injustice? And if we're talking about physical pain and the more obvious external things that Paulus had been focused on, then this certainly makes sense. It hurts more to be murdered than to commit murder, right? And so Paulus says, no, that's not the way it is at all, Socrates. Of course, it doesn't hurt more to commit injustice than to suffer it. So Socrates says, therefore, it doesn't exceed it in pain, at least. And Paulus says it sure doesn't. Socrates, so what's left is that it exceeds it in the other way. Paulus, yes. Socrates, in badness. Paulus, it looks that way. So now Paulus is starting to have to admit that his previous statement doesn't make any sense. According to what he just agreed, that beauty is true, good, and beautiful, that they're all connected. And now Socrates is saying, well, that means that if injustice is ugly, it must be bad, because it's certainly not more painful in a physical sense. So the only thing that could make it ugly is that it's bad, and you can see the badness of it, and that's what makes it ugly. And Paulus can't deny this. The logic of the argument makes this a necessary conclusion, although it's the opposite of what he was thinking in his brilliant distinction earlier in saying, oh yeah, I admit that it's ugly to commit injustice, but it's useful, it's beneficial. Now he has to admit, well, what makes it ugly is that it's bad and that we can see the badness of it. So Socrates now makes him face, okay, if you choose injustice, here's what you're choosing. You're preferring what's worse and uglier when it's more rather than less. You want more injustice, you want more ugliness, you want more badness. Does that make sense? And he says, don't shy away from answering, because we can tell that Paulus is now getting to the point where he's either going to have to completely admit that he's wrong, or he's going to have to try to wiggle out of this. Socrates promises, you won't get hurt, Paulus. But of course, that goes back to what Socrates was saying before. If our goal is truth and somebody points out we're wrong, then that's a benefit, because we can step away from the falsehood and we can learn something. But if our goal is to look good, or to show off, or to get power or prestige, then it does hurt, being exposed in error. Just answer with some class, he says to Paulus, by submitting to the speech as you would to a doctor, and either concur in what I'm asking or deny it. So Socrates is being a little tough with Paulus here, but he's also illustrating his own thesis at the same time. He's saying, look, you obviously made a mistake. You obviously, are saying two completely conflicting things, and you believe both of them when you said them. You honestly believed X, you honestly believe not X, but you can't actually believe both of these things. So this may hurt a little bit, but just like going to the doctor, it may hurt, but it's going to be good for you to admit this. And because that from here, you can learn. You can actually learn something about your own life, about your own happiness in life. And Paulus says, I certainly wouldn't prefer it, Socrates. In other words, I can't say that I prefer to do more badness, that I prefer to pile up, the ugliness and the badness in my life. Socrates says, would any other human being, so is that just your personal preference, that you don't want badness in your life? No, that's pretty much the definition of badness, is what we don't want. So it doesn't seem to be from this speech anyway. So Paulus here, what we're going to see, the way I would characterize this is that it's not so much that Socrates persuades Paulus that Socrates is right about these things. Paulus is going to be very reluctant to admit that the argument proves that Socrates is right. And that's a little different from being persuaded, because if people were perfectly reasonable, then once we saw that, the argument shows that something is right, then we would accept it. But not being perfectly reasonable, sometimes we resist. We resist what reason is telling us. And Paulus here is, he's going to remain skeptical, even though he's not going to be able to disprove what Socrates is saying. However, it's important to see that the argument is not simply abstract and some, abstract logic. It's not that Socrates is saying, according to the definitions of some words, we have to say that, injustice is bad and therefore it doesn't make sense to do it. Paulus actually admitted that injustice is ugly, and Paulus actually enthusiastically embraced the idea that beauty is good. So if beauty is good and injustice is ugly, then injustice must be bad. And unless he can unless he can backtrack on any of those things, then he can't get out of this conclusion that injustice is bad. And yet, those were all sincere things that he was saying. That's what he really thinks. He really thinks he's going to profit by injustice, but he also really thinks that it is ugly. And he also really loves beauty and thinks beauty is good. So one of the ways you could, translate this into practical terms, just to show that, again, this is not just an abstract argument. What this is revealing is, to the extent that beauty and goodness have an objective, reality to them, that things actually are beautiful and good or not, and that we can recognize this in our soul, then committing injustice, if it's something that is bad and is therefore ugly, what it means is that even as we think we're profiting from committing injustice, we're becoming ugly, right? I mean, our memory, our character, our habits of thinking and acting are all getting habituated into these acts of injustice, which are ugly. So we are becoming ugly. Now, an ugly thing is unattractive, it's repellent. So it means the consequence of injustice is that we become repellent to ourselves. This is where the idea of conscience comes from. That term did not exist in Plato's time, but the concept comes out of what we're looking at here in this dialogue. The concept of conscience is that we are attracted to what's good and we're repelled by what's evil. And particularly when we apply it to ourselves, we are attracted to ourselves more the more we develop a good character, and we are repelled by ourselves more the more that we develop a bad character. And that's what a guilty conscience would be, is just a repulsion towards ourselves. Okay, so that's what Socrates is showing Paulus, basically, is that you could commit all these injustices and get away with it, and then you become repugnant to yourself. Now, what kind of a life is that? A life where you have wealth and you have power and you have prestige, but you hate yourself? How are you going to be happy that way, right? It's not a recipe for happiness. So Socrates says, therefore, what I was saying is true, that neither I nor you nor any other human being would prefer to commit injustice rather than suffer it, precisely because it's a worse thing. And Paulus says, so it appears. He still doesn't really see it in reality, but he has to admit that the argument is showing that. So he's going to resist a little bit, but here's how Socrates will continue to drive the point home. He gives Paulus a chance to back out of the connection between justice and beauty. He says, well, can you say that it's not the case that all just things are beautiful to the extent that they're just? Tell me after you've thought it over carefully. So this is one way to wiggle out, and this is exactly what Callicles is going to do in the next section. Callicles is going to go that way and say, oh no, injustice is beautiful, justice is ugly. He's going to try that one out on Socrates, so we'll see how that one works. But Paulus isn't going to go there. He says, no, it seems to me that, yeah, justice is beautiful. I have to admit that. Therefore, Socrates says, someone who pays a just penalty has good things done to him. So if you've been guilty, let's say that you fell into this trap and you decided to be unjust and you're being corrected, you're being punished, isn't that beautiful because it's just? And Paulus says, well, it looks like it. Again, he's not really buying it. You would actually want to be punished. But Socrates says, therefore he's benefited. It's beneficial to be punished. Yes, Paulus admits. By contributing to the end, I suspect it does, Socrates asked, that he becomes better in his soul if he's justly disciplined. So this is one of the places where Socrates is pointing to what I said before, that we become habituated by what we do. So if we commit injustice, our soul becomes corrupted. It's not just individual acts, but it becomes our character. our disposition is towards injustice. So that's leading us down. Think if you're living in a way where you're going to hate yourself for living that way, then it really is a benefit to be punished, to be corrected, if that's what is going to help you to turn around and to change your life. It's going to prevent you from digging yourself deeper and deeper and deeper into that hole. So it's hard to see it that way, obviously. When you're in a state of injustice, committing injustices, you're not going to think about that it'd be beneficial to be punished. But just like, parents correcting their children, if they're doing it wisely and benevolently, they're doing it for the good of their children, because they know in the long run it's going to make their children happier to develop good habits. And Socrates is saying that's just the way it is with injustice. Like, once somebody has fallen into injustice, the best thing that can happen to them is to be corrected. And Paulus says, likely so. And he's not thrilled about it, but he recognizes the logic. So Socrates continues to tie this into the condition of the soul in general, like he had said before with Gorgias, that there's health of soul. How does this all relate to the metaphor of a healthy soul? And Socrates says, you believe also there's some bad condition in the soul, of course, says Paulus. And don't you call this injustice, stupidity, cowardice, and that sort of thing? And Paulus says, quite so. So what Socrates is gesturing towards here is the cardinal virtues, wisdom, justice, courage, and prudence, temperance, the other one. There's some different terms for them, of course: wisdom or prudence, justice, temperance or moderation, courage or fortitude. And each of those is looking at some different aspects of what is true, good, or beautiful, basically. So our soul is capable. This is what it comes down to. Our soul is the part of us that is capable of understanding what is true, good, and beautiful, and then responding to that with our passions, our will, and our actions. And so the virtues are those things by which we correctly grasp and respond to the true, good, and beautiful. The vices are those things by which we fall short one way or the other. Here he's saying injustice, stupidity, and cowardice as examples of things where we fall short of what is true, good, and beautiful. And Paulus says, quite so. So this does make sense to Paulus. There's certain conditions of the soul. Obviously, if somebody is stupid, for example, this is not something that's attractive about a person. And Socrates is saying, well, injustice is like that as well, right? If you know this is an unjust person, and you can see that this is an unjust person, that makes them unattractive to you, doesn't it? Yes. And cowardice would be another example. So Socrates says, so for monetary possessions, body and soul, which are three things, you've mentioned a trio of bad conditions: poverty, disease, and injustice. So he extends the metaphor, health of the body, sort of the health of the bank account, you could say, and then the health of the soul. And you can see for each of those things, for somebody's financial condition, for somebody's physical condition, for somebody's psychological condition, each of those you can see good or bad overall conditions that they're in. And Paul says, yes. Then which of these bad conditions is the ugliest? Isn't it injustice and a bad condition of the soul altogether? And Paulus says, by a long way. So which one would you rather have? Would you rather have an empty bank account? Would you rather have a physical illness? Or would you rather have a disease of your soul? And Paulus agrees that the disease of the soul is the worst of all those things. It would be better to lose your money, better to lose your physical health than it would be to lose the health of the soul. And why is that? Well, external goods are necessary to some extent, but if we think about what the soul is, as I mentioned earlier, the consequence of having an ugly soul is hating yourself, right? So you could be poor, you could be sick, physically sick, and still having a good conscience and basically at peace with yourself as a human being. Or you could be rich and you could be physically healthy, but you could hate yourself. So which one would be better? And Paulus is agreeing that I guess I would rather be sick and poor, but actually at peace with myself, rather than be rich and physically healthy but hate myself. And Socrates says, well, what that means is that the happiest person is the one who has no evil in his soul, since that showed itself to be the greatest of evils. Paulus agrees. As far as the argument goes, it's very clear. He's now, he's catching on to the logic of this pretty well. He's not kicking and screaming anymore too much about, this is crazy, how could you say this? And Socrates says, presumably the second happiest is the one who's set free from it. This would be the person who is unjust but is punished and then potentially converts and becomes just again. That would be the second best. The best thing would be never to commit any kind of crimes, but the second best thing would be, after having done it, to be corrected. And Paulus says it looks like it. So there's a lot we could say about the significance of what Socrates has laid out here, but in terms of this dialogue, there's going to be one more round that Socrates has to go through before he can rest with these conclusions, because there's a character in this dialogue. And remember, this is the character that we know least about historically, and there's different hypotheses about whether he's an actual historical figure, whether he's just a literary device, or there's something in between going on. But in any case, this is actually taking place in Callicles' home, and Callicles is going to butt in now. He came in briefly before, but this is going to be, he's going to get into a major argument with Socrates. And we'll just conclude this session and lay the groundwork for next time by seeing how he initially butts in and how he frames his objection. And he starts by saying, tell me, Socrates, should we take you as being serious now or as playing games? So unlike Paulus, who is kind of reluctant to accept these conclusions, but when he sees the logic of it, he's not going to argue. I mean, he's going to say, okay, fine, the logic says that. It must be true. Not to mention that he probably really does believe that injustice is ugly. So the point actually makes some sense to him, even though he might have a long way to go to really absorb it. But Callicles, as we're going to see, he definitely does not think that there's anything ugly about injustice, and he's going to be willing to push that point very far. So he thinks, like Paulus was saying before, that Socrates couldn't really believe what he's saying. Because he says, if you are serious, Socrates, and if these things that you're saying turn out to be true, would our life as human beings not be turned upside down? And would we not, as it seems, be doing everything that's opposite to what we ought to do? So this is a very crucial point in the dialogue. It comes up in a number of different ways, but here Callicles puts it in a very poignant way, pretty much in the middle of the dialogue here, which is that if Socrates is right, then the whole world is wrong, basically. And right and wrong in the sense that everything is upside down, everything is backwards. Everybody is doing everything exactly the wrong way if Socrates is correct. So in other words, most people most of the time are trying to see how much injustice they can get away with. Maybe not doing heinous crimes, but just within whatever their comfort zone is, how much can I get away with? And according to Socrates, it should be the opposite. People should be just as much as they can, and if they ever stray, then they should be trying to correct themselves and find any way to correct themselves from it. So Callicles, as this indicates, he's not going to give in easily. He's not going to say, "Hey, I'm willing to turn around, go the opposite direction in my life. You're going to have to prove that to me, Socrates." And he is going to give Socrates a hard time. So in the next session, we're going to look at the beginning of this wrestling match between Socrates and Callicles on the question of how we should live our lives, justly or unjustly.